For your all's sake, I'm going to use a timer. Go back to my teaching days. If I don't hear a bell ring, we just keep going. I'm also using notes because, well, when Trevor asked me last week, he's like, just because I think I did this a few years ago, he's like, just similar to last time. And I thought, oh yeah, that's great. And so of course I put it off till like Friday night, and I went to look, and I'm like, I couldn't find any of my notes from last time. And I was like, I already told Trevor, oh yeah, I've got a handle. And so I'm like, I can't text him now and say like, oh, so I'm like, well, I'll just make this up again. So, it's part of the fruits of the Spirit, and I thought, well, let's start there, like, because I've been kind of curious this last year or two about like where did the original root meanings of things, and if you guys have watched Trevor at all, that's one of the things I love most about his messages is both when he shares like scripture, he talks not only about like the context of the time and how that scripture fits in, but also like the words that we use may not necessarily have been like the same word that the authors when they wrote it, because things don't always translate. There's not direct translations, and so you have to kind of go back and like appreciate like the language that was used at the time and what it might have meant and how we might interpret it differently. So I thought, well, maybe there's something about in the passage about fruits of the Spirit, about generosity, that I could kind of look up and see if there might be something there that could be interesting. And if do you have the scripture? I should even ask. Oh, it's not up. All right. So, well, this is so I pull up Bible Gateway, and I'm like, I search fruits of the Spirit, because I don't know it I'm not a guy who can remember anything. And I read, the passages out of Galatians, and it goes, but the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Wait a minute. And I was like, well, I must just have that was the NIV version. I'm like, generosity isn't in that one. So I'm like, I'll check out other versions. English Standard, fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, it's New Life. Love, joy, peace, not giving up, being kind, being good, having faith, being gentle, being the boss over our own desires. No generosity there. King James, maybe we don't usually use King James, but love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness, temperance. I thought, great, thanks, Trevor, you set me up. Sure. Talk about generosity, because we're in the fruits of the Spirit, but it's not actually a fruit of the Spirit. So I asked him this morning, he's like, well, in the version, what version are we using? NRSV, which, there's like 400, so I didn't scroll through them all. But I guess if you use the NRSV, generosity is one of the fruits. But so I went on this little adventure about, well, how can we use fruit of the Spirit and tie that to generosity? So this is the sense-making journey I've been on the last 48 hours. And kind of the two things that kind of stood out to me along this sense-making journey is this distinction between generosity and meeting expectation, and the difference between an act of generosity and being generous. Because as I was trying to find, like, what can we learn from what Jesus tells us or the Bible tells us about generosity, there were some things that really hit home in ways that I hadn't really made sense of myself. And so I thought, well, what the heck? I'm going to share with you that kind of sense-making journey in hopes that maybe there's something in there that helps you see how these things fit together as well. So anytime you talk about generosity, like probably if you don't know, if you've been in church like more than a few times, I'm sure you probably heard the story about the widow's offering. So I thought, well, let's start there, because that's like a great example where Jesus talks directly about generosity. And the widow's offering is Jesus is sitting with his disciples, and they're kind of in the area of the temple, and there's a box where you give your offerings. So it's a very public kind of, everyone can see what you're putting in for your offering. That would be super awkward, but I guess that was the way they did it at the time. And the story goes, Jesus sat down at opposite the place where the offerings were put and watched the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury. And many rich people threw in large amounts, but a poor widow came and put in 2 very small copper coins, only worth a few cents. calling his disciples to him, Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all others. They all gave out of their wealth, but she out of her poverty put in everything, all she had to live on." And I thought about that for a minute because I've heard that story multiple times when churches are getting ready to do stewardship campaigns. Because if nothing says dig deep and write the bigger check, then, a story about Jesus saying, well, that poor woman gave everything she got, so you can write a bigger check today. And I'm not sure Jesus meant for that to be weaponized in that way. So it made me curious about what is this story about, because I think I've only ever taken it at surface value. Like, rich people show up and they give, and then this poor widow shows up, and she's literally giving everything. And is Jesus saying hey, I want you to give up everything? Literally, bankrupt yourself and give it to a church? That just doesn't seem to fit. And if so, there's a whole bunch of us that are not meeting what Jesus is calling for. But I don't think. I'm not a pastor, but that's probably not what he meant, was it? Who knows? Trevor doesn't know either, so I guess we'll figure it out together. But so then that got me curious about the offering box, and so then I did a little digging into the Old Testament, which is always an adventure, and because that story is often used in stewardship, which then the concept of tithing comes up. And tithing, gets to be a really sensitive subject. Some churches it's very clear, it's X percentage, and you tell us how much you make, and then we calculate the percentage, and you give that much, and that's what you have to do. Which is kind of how that is kind of how it's laid out in the Old Testament. Some of the verses in Deuteronomy, it's pretty clear when they talk about be sure to set aside 1/10 of all that your fields produce each year. And that's typically where people say it should be 10%, is from that verse out of Deuteronomy in 14. What was interesting when I read this again was I hadn't read the rest of it, but before I get to that, I just want to, this point came to me is that, I don't think in this story, Jesus points out that people are making a show out of doing what they were expected to do. And he wasn't saying, don't do what you're expected to do. There's a reason why in the Old Testament it was the 10%, and it was because that 10% was needed by those in the community who couldn't provide for themselves. I didn't realize it. This is part of that I didn't realize, but it's every third year you took your tithe and you put it into storage. It wasn't 1/10 every year, it was every third year, at least in that Deuteronomy. But the point being is that there were people in the community who weren't able to provide for themselves, and that's why we set that aside for others. And so that when we think about the intent, it's that we recognize that when we are in a community with other people, we recognize that some people may not have the ability, the capability, they're in a situation where they can't take care of themselves, and that we are called to take care of one another. So the act of tithing is really an act of love. It's really an act of I want to be a part of a community, and being part of a community is demonstrating that I get something out of being part of this community, and part of the expectation then is I give something to this community. And in this story, it's rooted in the act of tithing, because that was a way to demonstrate giving to those in the community that couldn't. And on that note, when we talk about this church getting started, and one of the things we know that in order for Neighbors to exist, that we have to give, and that's, if we want this to be a community, there's an expectation that we have to give of our time and of our great ideas and of our effort, of inviting people, and of our treasure. That's just part of the giving. But I don't know that necessarily is the act of generosity. I think that to me is the expectation. If you want to be in a community, if you want to love one another, the expectation is that part of demonstrating your love is to contribute to that community in a way. So then I was like, well, how does this story get us into generosity? Because is giving everything the point of being generous? And so that was, I went back and reread the widow's offering piece again about, the rich people throwing in large amounts, which in order to have, to feed a lot of people, you needed the wealthy people to their 10% was important to be able to feed a lot of poor people and take care of those. I think it's the why. As I sat and looked at the story, it's the why and the how that they did it. And it took me to a story. A good friend of mine, we worked together many years ago, and since that time we've gone different paths. He went to work for a very large company, and part of this company did not have a great reputation. And they, as part of their corporate giving efforts, would, instead of like supporting something, like United Way or something like that, they would give grants in local communities. They spread a lot of money across lots of communities around the country. And they, people would submit what they thought the money should go to, like whether a fire department or something like that. And he told me, we were talking about it, and he's like, well, here's the thing, like, in those communities, what we do is we go to our customers in those communities and find out what was important to them, and then we pick the things that they are important. So, we want to be caught doing good in front of our customers. And I thought, wow, that doesn't feel good at all. that is, I understand why, from as a company trying to build your reputation and make people feel good about you, that makes perfect sense. But if we think about why we would give, if it's to get caught doing something good, to have people go, gosh, what a great person. Look at all that they give to this organization, or look at how much they tirelessly pour into the church. If that's why we're doing it, I don't know that drew me then back to the fruits of the Spirit, because the part right before the fruits of the Spirit it talks about, the acts of the flesh, which is in Galatians, they're contrasting between, like, the acts of the flesh is about the world. Like, if what you care about is about the world and society at large and kind of your own selfishness, like, what you're going to see is, impurity, debauchery, idolatry, hatred, discord, jealousy, fits of rage, selfish ambition, dissension, factions, and envy. And then I go back to the widow's offering story, and you're like, was Jesus making the point that when you give, if you give out of an self-ambition, the fact that you're meeting your expectation does not necessarily mean that you are living a life of generosity. And that story from my friend has stuck with me for a long time, because as we've grown our business and we've had more means, than we've had in the past, like, I'm very conscientious of, I don't want people to feel like I want to get credit because of our success, that like, hey, look at how successful I am. In fact, I try to do most things where people don't know that we're involved, or that I can help in ways that are more behind the scenes. Being up here is really uncomfortable for me, but what I think is what it speaks to me, I guess, is that when we do what we're expected to do, we can either do it in a way that is, we feel obligated, like we're being guilted into it, or we see it as a way to get recognized for it. That's a different thing than I think what Jesus is asking us to do when we're in community with one another. And the reason that really hit home for me was because of the irony, I think, of the other character in Jesus' story, the widow. Because when you go back to those scriptures in the Old Testament, the people that are pointed out in those scriptures of who the tithes are for are consistently orphans, widows, and foreigners. Like, over and over again, it's orphans, widows, and foreigners. Now, the foreigners part, I had to do a little understanding around that, because we think of Jewishness right now as being like a faith, like I practice the Jewish faith. Well, at the time, there was no separation. It's like, for us, it's like being American. Like, there's no separation between being an American and like practicing Americanness. Like, you're just an American. And at the time, it was like, it wasn't the Jewish faith. It was just, you were a Jew, and it was how godly were you. But you didn't choose the Jewish faith. You were an Israeli, a Hebrew. And part of being in that community was that but in that time, orphans and widows and foreigners, so people who were not of the ethnicity, from the line of David, but were living in that community, they were welcome, but they often, they didn't have provisions built in that would, that families were to take care of them. And so if they weren't able to sustain themselves, part of the expectation wasn't that they got kicked out of the community. The expectation is that we as a community take care of those even though they're not Jewish, which is, wow, does that speak to us today? But let's not go there. But the point is that Jesus in this story that he tells is he uses a widow of all people. He's using like the kind of the lowest class of society at the time, and the ironic thing is the rich people who are putting their offering in, like that is intended to be used to take care of people like her. So it's like, and she's the one showing up, and as opposed to being there looking for help, she's giving to try and help those who she thinks have it even worse off than she does. And so, gosh, I have to go back to my notes because this is, and I, so then the question is like, is Jesus trying to tell us like, hey, when you get to a really good place with me, you're going to want to give it all away to help everyone else? I don't know that that's exactly what he was saying. And I don't think Jesus was trying to do an early version of like abundance ministry, or what's that called? Prosperity ministry. I don't think Jesus was saying, hey, if you trust me and give away all your coins, like good things will happen. Because he doesn't mention that. He doesn't promise that. There's nothing in his ministry which is a quid pro quo, like you do this for me, I'll do this for you. Like, so I don't think Jesus was saying like, hey, give away everything, it'll be fine, like I'll take care of you. My interpretation, and man, I wish the author would have unpacked a little more. My interpretation of this story is that you watch these really rich people take their money and they're probably looking around and very proud and like trying to make sure, like, did the Johnsons notice how much we put in this week, kind of thing. Like, there was just a lot of that. And then this very poor woman shows up, and my guess is that she beamed. Shut up, Seth. Sorry, I'm thinking about I'm thinking about people who we meet in life who, like, gosh, you got nothing. And they are full of love and acceptance. You're like, where the hell did that come from? Like, how can you be so full? And that's what I think he pointed to as this. And he's like, because if you look in where this story comes, it's like one story after the greatest commandment. Our whole mission of love yourself, love God, love yourself, love your neighbor, like that comes from the greatest commandment where he says, like, all those other things, like, don't worry about them. Like, live by this commandment, like, love me and love your neighbor like you love yourself. And then, like, the next thing we see in that chapter is this story of this widow who shows up. And she just loves. And she believes that she's going to have enough. And I think that to me, that's what I take, is that she shows up and she goes, I have enough. I am enough. I can give away this because these 2 coins, they aren't going to make or break me because what I have everything I need. And to me, that's what I took away from this week was we can either do an act of generosity, like we can show up and we can serve and we can give things to, we can write checks to this church. We can do all sorts of acts of generosity, but being generous means we have to be in a place when we look at those fruits of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, that we look at those things and we say, I've got that. And that's enough. And I can give to everyone else now because I'm fulfilled enough that I can be generous with my love and my patience and my money and my time. Man, I hope we all feel like we have enough, we are enough, and that we can give everything else to those that need it. Because goodness knows, the world needs a little more generosity right now. So thanks for the time. Sorry, next time I'll pull myself together a little better, Trevor. But I so appreciate just being a part of this community. Man, I get so much out of this. Thank you for pouring into me without even knowing it. I appreciate it deeply.